Hello friends, I am Vijay Dave, lecturer in English, working at Government Polytechnic Junagadh under Commissionerate of Technical Education, Government of Gujarat. Today I am going to deal with a short story, A Day's Wait. Short story written by Ernest Hemingway. Very beautiful story we are going to discuss. First of all, I would like to tell you about the objectives of this particular lecture or session. At the end of this lecture, you will be able to understand what a short story is. We will discuss the main components of the short story. Thereafter, you will be able to understand different elements of a short story. You will be able to know briefly about the life of Hemingway, who has written this particular short story, and relate it with the story A Day's Wait. You will also be able to summarize the story under discussion, and you will also be able to critically appreciate the story. And thereafter, in the end, you will be able to give answer to the questions asked from the story. Particularly, we will be discussing MCQs or multiple choice questions. So first of all, let us see what is a short story. A short story is a piece of prose fiction. In other words, it is a narrative or a tale of fictitious events. The incidents, characters, etc., all these things are purely imaginative. Making use of imaginary incidents, characters, etc., the author puts before us the reality of life. The author, in one way, by writing a short story, wants to say that this is life according to me, according to my point of view. A short story generally focuses on one single incident in the life of an imaginary character. As the scope of short story is very limited, the author doesn't have much chance or much time or space to discuss different aspects of life at length. So particularly, he focuses on one single incident. As the name short story suggests, it is a story which is short, so short that it can be read at a single sitting. One of the authors of the short story has defined the short story, has defined the length of the short story as such that, suppose that you are sitting in a train, and when the train starts from one station and you start reading the story, when the next station comes, the reading is over. So much short it is that you are able to complete the reading of a particular short story from one station to the other station. The narrative of the story is so much focused that it leaves a single impression in the mind of the reader. Each and every word are chosen very carefully by the short story writer, and this is the reason why he or she is able to build a single impression in the mind of the reader. Discussing the elements of a short story. First of all, we are going to say something about character. Character is one of the most important elements of a short story. What do we mean by character? The imaginary people the story is about. For example, if we are watching a movie, Three Idiots, then the characters of Rancho is there and some other characters are there. So this is what is meant by character in a short story, and these characters are imaginary. These characters are lifelike, almost like those that we meet and see in our real life. Because as we have seen or discussed in the earlier slide, in the story, the author shows the reality of life. So, the character, which is considered to be one of the most important elements of a short story, they are lifelike. They look or they talk or they face different situations or circumstances of life as we human beings do in our real life. The main action in the story revolves around this character. There is one central character and maybe one or two important incidents, and these incidents, they revolve around these main character. The character comes in contact with the incident and he or she will give reactions to these incidents, and in this way the incidents, they begin to develop, and similarly the characters also, they develop in the span of the short story telling. Another element of a short story is plot. Every story has a plot. Now, what is plot? Plot is a sequence or a series of events or incidents of which a story is composed. What is it? Let me repeat. It is a sequence or a series of events or incidents of which the fabric of the story has been made or composed. These incidents are interconnected as one thing happens as a result of the other. There is a relationship between these incidents, the relationship of cause and effect. One incident happens because of the result of the earlier or previous incident that has taken place in the short story. Another very important element of a short story is conflict. Conflict is the main element of a plot. As in our real life, there is a conflict or there are a number of conflicts. Similarly, because short story, it is the reflection of life, conflict has to be there and conflict is there. As you read the story, you see the main character in conflict with himself or other characters in the story or with the forces of nature or society. There are different types of conflicts in the short story. A person or a character in the story may be in conflict with himself. In such stories, there will be element of internal conflict going on in the mind of the character himself. There may be a conflict between two different characters, or there is a conflict between the character in the story with the forces of nature, or there may be a conflict between character and society, different traditions, for example, of the society. The plot usually has three parts. Beginning, it introduces the characters, setting, and conflict. So in the plot of the short story, while introducing the plot, in the beginning, the author introduces characters, gives introduction of the characters, familiarizes the reader with different characters. The author builds up the setting of the short story, setting, time of the short story in which the story takes place, and he also introduces the element of conflict in the story. Middle portion, in this part of the story, the characters react to the conflict. Slowly and gradually, the plot begins to develop, and the element of conflict which was introduced in the beginning of the story, it begins to develop when the characters, they begin to react with the conflict or react to the conflict. In the end of the third part of the conflict, in this part the conflict is generally resolved. At the end of the story we see some kind of resolution to the conflict. Another very important element of a short story is setting. What is setting? Setting is the time, place, or environment in which the story takes place. To be able to make the reader visualize what is happening in the short story, it is very important to set the incidents or the characters of the short story in a particular time. For example, some stories are set in 19th century India. Some stories are set in the earlier half of the 20th century. The time of the story, place, imaginary place where the characters reside or where the characters are set, or environment in which the story takes place. Setting helps the reader to visualize the imaginary world that the author has created. For example, in cinema, when we see a cinema or a movie in a theater or a television, there is a big screen and we are able to see everything on that screen. But what happens in literature or short story, the author only has the medium of words. Through words, through the choice of words, very powerful words, the author makes the reader visualize. When the reader begins to read the story, he is able to see in the screen of his mind what is actually happening in the short story. Setting helps to create a suitable atmosphere or mood in the story. Sometimes the mood of the story is gloomy, the mood of the story is sad. So, to bring out that particular sad or gloomy mood, the particular atmosphere is chosen to bring out that particular mood. Setting is often used to heighten the effect of the central incidents in the story. This is also another very important function of the setting. What does it do? It heightens, or it helps to heighten the effect of the central incidents in the story. Another element of a short story is theme. Like novel, poetry, or drama, which are different forms of literature, the short story has a theme. What is theme? It is the meaning or the significance that the author wants to convey to the reader. When we read the story or when we have completed the reading of the short story, we are able to understand some significance, or we are able to make out some meaning out of the story. This is known as the theme of the short story. A short story may deal with a particular issue, a moral concern, an aspect of life, or characters. This particular issue might be treated as a central theme of the story. There may be a moral concern. For example, the internal conflict in the mind of the central character between the forces of good and evil. This might be the theme of a short story. An aspect of life or character. In some stories, the author shows one aspect of life. Sometimes some important characters are there, and through the portrayal of these characters, the author is able to convey a particular theme through his short story. Another important element of a short story is style. Each short story has each storyteller or the author has his own style or way of narrating a story. How do you say certain things? How do you express certain incidents? This is known as the style of a particular author. Style is a writer's unique way of telling the story. It is often not only what writers say, but how they say it that gives a story its peculiar charm and effect. So not only the choice of words is important for a short story writer, but how these choice of words are used to convey a particular meaning or significance in a short story, it is very important. Style consists of the choice of words, sentence structure, dialogues, etc. What kind of words are particularly chosen? Some authors, they deliberately make use of certain adjectives. Sentence structure, a particular sentence structure is chosen to convey particular idea. And dialogues. Some writers, they make ample use of dialogues, while some writers, they make very less use of dialogues and they prefer to describe what is happening in the short story rather than making use of dialogues. Some writers used first-person narrative, whereas some use third-person narrative to achieve the desired effect in the story. In which way the story is being told? In some stories, first-person narrative, the telling of the story is done by the pronoun I, first-person narrative, whereas in some stories, third-person narrative is used to give objective touch or effect to the story. The element of surprise. This is also considered to be one of the most important elements of a short story, the element of surprise. The element of surprise provides the story its great appeal. When you start reading the story and when the reading happens till the middle portion of the story, before you reach the end, you begin to visualize or you begin to think as a reader that the story is going to end in a certain way. But when we come to the end of the short story, it ends in a very surprising manner. So this surprise end, it also gives great appeal to the short story. Maybe this is the author's way of telling that this is life according to me. Life gives us so many surprises daily. It is not fixed what is going to happen the next moment or the next day. So this thing also happens in the short story. Surprise element, the element of surprise. This element is often called sting in the tail. As if at the end of the story, it gives us a sting. Tail means the end of the short story and sting means giving a surprise to the reader. The reader feels that he has been stung at the end of the short story. So this particular expression, sting in the tail, like a scorpion, as in the tail of the scorpion there is a sting which is known to be more powerful than it is in its mouth. So this happens in the short story. The story ends with elements of surprise. Stories such as After 20 Years, written by O. Henry, An Astrologer's Day, written by R.K. Narayan, Post Office, written by Dhumketu, a very famous Gujarati short story and translated in so many languages of the world, and also the particular short story that we are going to discuss in this particular lecture, A Day's Wait, written by Ernest Hemingway. These all stories end with a surprise ending. Now we have discussed different elements of a short story so that we can appreciate the story under discussion in a better way. Now let's know something about the life of Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway. To understand the story in a better way, it is quite good or necessary for the readers to know something about the life of its author who has penned this story. Hemingway, the author of this particular story, he lived a very adventurous life. So in this particular slide, you will be able to know the adventurous life of the short story writer. Hemingway lived a life full of adventures. Besides being one of the world's most loved writers, Hemingway was a fan of bullfighting, very adventurous sport, bullfighting. He was also a hunter and a fisherman. Hemingway participated in both world wars. Many of his novels and short stories are based on his experiences during wartime. It is believed by many critics that the suffering of his central characters is just what Hemingway has suffered, such as the wounds from the wars, insomnia, and strong frustrations. So it is believed by many critics of Hemingway that there is an element of autobiographical element in the stories of Hemingway. The story A Day's Wait also has an autobiographical element. While Hemingway was living in France, his son was down with fever and behaved similarly to the 9-year-old boy in the story. It is believed by some of the short story writers that the central incidents that happens in this particular story, the central incidents of a 9-year-old boy Shaz who is suffering with fever, this particular incident is believed to have actually happened in the real life of Hemingway with his son himself. Now let's see the summary of the short story. A Day's Wait is a short story written by Nobel Prize winner Ernest Hemingway. This story first appeared in the volume The Snows of Kilimanjaro in 1933. In the story, Shaz, a 9-year-old boy, was looking ill. This is the beginning of the story in which the central character Shaz, whose age is just 9 years, he is looking ill. He was shivering, his face was white due to illness, his face was white or pale, showing lack of blood, and he walked slowly as though it ached to move. There are symptoms of illness in his physique also, that he is not able to move properly because of illness. The doctor was called in because Shaz was ill. For his treatment, a doctor was called. After investigation, Shaz was diagnosed with influenza, which is popularly known as flu, a kind of cold fever. Some symptoms of cold is there, and there is fever also in the body. To cure Shaz, the doctor prescribed 3 different medicines. During the talk between the doctor and Shaz's father, Shaz overheard that he had a temperature of 102 degrees. not knowing that it was in Fahrenheit and misunderstood it to be Celsius scale. When the doctor came, took Shaz's temperature, the doctor told Shaz's father that Shaz's temperature was 102 degrees. Now what happens? Shaz overheard the talk between doctor and his father, and from that talk Shaz hears that he was having 102 degrees temperature. But Shaz was not sure that the temperature, Shaz did not know that the temperature which was measured by the doctor was in Fahrenheit, and Shaz misunderstood it to be in Celsius scale. Because of this particular thing, or overhearing, misunderstanding in the reading of the temperature by the doctor, there is introduced the element of conflict in the mind of Shaz. The conflict thus gets introduced. This sets a conflict in the mind of Shaz, who had heard from a classmate in a school in France that a temperature beyond 44 degrees is abnormal. And since he was having 102, he was bound to die shortly. Now what happens in the story? Just now, Shaz hears that he is having this much temperature over 100 degrees. Now, this is correlated with incidents in the past. In the past, Shaz, he used to study in a school in France, and from his classmate in a school, he happened to hear that a temperature beyond 44 degrees is abnormal. And because now Shaz knows that his temperature was 102, death is bound to happen. He was going to die shortly. Due to this misinterpretation or misunderstanding, Shaz spent his whole day in bed, thinking about death, waiting for death. So the title of the story, A Day's Wait. In this particular short story, a 9-year-old boy Shaz, he waits for his death. He spends the whole day detached from his surroundings. He is not affected by what is happening around him, because he is very much preoccupied by the thoughts of death, and is staring at the foot of his bed. Gazing. Staring means to look constantly at something or some person. So, Shaz is continuously and constantly looking at the foot of the bed. This shows the conflict is going on in the mind of the Shaz, who has overheard this particular talk between doctor and his father, and he was waiting for his death. Now Shaz did not want his father to stay in the room with him, because he thought that his father would catch the deadly disease that he had, and further because it would bother his father to watch his dear son dying. So he wanted to remain alone and face death heroically. When father, he came to know that Shaz was having influenza or flu, he did not want to leave his 9-year-old son alone in his room. So what happens? He started reading a book so that Shaz did not feel alone. But Shaz, he did not want his father to stay in the room because of these two reasons. Because he thought that he was having a very deadly disease, and if his father, he sits very close to him, he might catch the infection, and the thing that is going to happen with him might happen with his father. So he told his father that if he wished, he can go out of the room. Later on, when Shaz asked his father when he was going to die, in the end of the story, the Shaz made a question to his father when he was going to die. His father clarified his doubts regarding the temperature by giving him an example of the difference between miles and kilometers and explained that the normal temperature is different in different kinds of thermometers. In the story, two types of medical thermometers have been mentioned. In the first kind of thermometer, which is generally used in Europe, 37 degrees temperature is considered normal, while in the second kind of thermometer, which is used in America, 98 degrees temperature is considered normal. Because of the confusion between the reading of these two thermometers, Shaz feels the internal conflict in his mind, and he thinks that he is going to die. Now, learning in detail about these two temperatures, the first kind of thermometer shows the measurement in Celsius, while the second one shows the measurement in Fahrenheit. Shaz was ignorant of the fact that the doctor's diagnosis was in Fahrenheit. He did not know this particular fact, and he thought that the doctor's diagnosis was in Celsius, and because of that he began to think that he was going to die, since he was having 102 degrees temperature, which was actually quite normal. This is an apt, very appropriate and suitable title for the story, because Shaz had a misunderstanding regarding the readings of the thermometer and thought that he was going to die. So he spent his whole day waiting for his death. So the title, A Day's Wait. Now friends, you have known the summary of the story. Let us discuss other elements of the story in details. Characters. What are the main characters in this particular story, A Day's Wait? Shaz is there, a 9-year-old boy, Shaz, who is the most important character in the story. Then Shaz's father, caring father, and the character of doctor is there. Some other characters which actually do not appear in the story, but they work in the background to form some kind of misinterpretation in the mind of Shaz. These background people are schoolboys in France. Talking about setting up the story is set in fall or early winter. Now, how do we come to know that in this particular season of the time this story has been set? So we know this when we read about the ice on the ground. When Shaz's father goes out for shooting, the author describes the outside atmosphere outside the room of Shaz, and there we come to read that there is a ice on the ground. From this description, we can say that the story has been set in fall or early winter. The story opens or begins early in the morning, continues throughout the day, and ends the next day. So again, the suitability of the title, A Day's Wait. The story runs for one complete day. The story takes place in the dark room of a house, and a hunting scene is set in a countryside in America. Here we can mark the importance of the setting. The story again is being set in the dark room of the house, which heightens the gloominess of atmosphere or gloomy mood of the short story. Why gloomy mood? Because Shaz is waiting for his death. That's why the story has been set in a dark room. The weather outside is cold, which heightens the mood of the story, which is coldly serious. From the very beginning of the short story till the end of the story, and all the dialogues, choice of words, etc., everything seems to be very serious. This is in correlation with the outside atmosphere or weather, which is also very cold. So this also heightens the effect of the story. Talking about narrative technique, the way of telling the story of Hemingway. The story takes place in the past. Therefore, the author uses flashback technique to narrate the story, talking about the past. Here, the father of a 9-year-old boy recounts what has already passed. He tells us the story which has already happened in the past, making use of flashback technique. This flashback to the past is then narrated chronologically, one by one, from the beginning to the end. Hemingway uses the first-person narrative in the story. This technique forces the reader to see everything in the story through father's point of view, and so the reader cannot penetrate into the child's psyche. What is happening in the mind of a 9-year-old boy Shaz, the reader is not able to see or penetrate or think, because deliberately the short story has been told in first person narrative. In this way, the author is able to keep the element of suspense till the end of the story. We are able to know what is happening in the story through the medium of Shaz's father. So the element of suspense is kept, or the author is able to keep this element till the end of the story. Plot diagram. Let us discuss the plot diagram, how the plot is developed. Exposition. What is exposition? Exposition is a narrative device, the way of telling the story, which is generally used in the beginning of the story to introduce the story, its main characters, to form its setting. This is known as exposition of the story, in which the story might be exposed or begun or introduced. So introduces the story, introduces main character Shaz and his father, and setting. In A Day's Wait, the story element is introduced when Shaz is looking ill, leading to a doctor being called to diagnose that he has caught flu. This is the exposition of the story. Rising action, when the main action which was earlier introduced in the exposition, it begins to rise or develop. Rising action introduces a complication in the story that creates some sort of conflict for the central character, which then gathers momentum, which then develops slowly and gradually. In this story, A Day's Wait, the rising action occurs when Shaz overhears the doctor announcing that he has 102-degree temperature. This results in the boy's strange behavior and unusual responses, because when Shaz happens to hear from the talk between doctor and his father, when he hears that he has 102-degree temperature, he thinks that this is very abnormal temperature, and he may not be able to live for a longer time. So he behaves very strangely and his responses are also very abnormal. In this way, the action rises slowly and gradually. Climax of the story. Climax is described as the moment of greatest emotional tension in the life of the protagonist or central character, leading to a turning point in the plot. Climax, in other words, may be described as that part of the short story where the interest of the story is intensified. It reaches to its peak moment. In the present story, the peak point comes when Shaz asks his father, "About what time do you think I am going to die?" As he has misinterpreted the severity of his temperature, seriousness of his temperature, confusing the two different types of thermometer readings. That's why this particular question to his father, "When I am going to die." This might be called the climax of the story. Now, falling action. Falling action is a point in the story where the tension diminishes and ends with the resolution of the complications in the mind of the central character. In the story under discussion, the action seems to fall. In other words, falling action happens when Shaz's father clears his confusion between the two different scales, Fahrenheit and Celsius. Now Shaz is relieved to learn that he is not going to die, that between these two temperatures, namely Fahrenheit and Celsius, there is a great difference, as there is a difference between miles and kilometers. So Shaz is able to understand that there is a great difference and there is nothing to worry about and he is not going to die. Falling action. Thereafter, resolution. In other words, it is known as denouement. This is the point at which conflicts or problems are resolved in some way. At the end of the story, Shaz, realizing that his sickness was not going to be the end of his life, he cries very easily at little things that were of no importance. This shows that now Shaz has become very much normal. Till now, he was holding his emotions. He was showing signs of self-restraint. In one way, he was seeing or watching the dooming death, but in other way, he was not showing his emotions very much like a very mature and brave man. He was going to face death very bravely. But when he happens to realize that his sickness was not that much serious and there was no sign of the end of his life, he begins to cry. His emotions are released in the form of tears and he cries very easily at little things that were of no importance. Talking about the theme of the story, according to Hemingway, a man may be destroyed but not defeated. This might be the theme of so many works of Hemingway. Same thing happens, or same theme is there in this particular story, A Day's Wait. Death and courage are predominant themes in many of Hemingway's writings. For Hemingway, courage is a person's inner strength and equanimity or balancing in the face of his greatest existential crisis, that is the possibility or certainty of death. In this particular story, Shaz thinks that he is going to die. But in one way he is afraid, but he has determined to face his crisis or to face death like a brave man. So this is the theme of the story, death as well as facing death courageously. In the story A Day's Wait, Hemingway shows the harrowing experience of a 9-year-old boy who, through a misinterpretation about the severity of his temperature, faces death consciously like a man, like a yogi. Talking about style of the story. Now, the style of this particular story, it was influenced by the earlier profession of Hemingway. Formerly, Hemingway was a journalist. In this story, Hemingway uses journalistic, detached and indifferent style. He merely reports objectively what has happened using minimum words for narration. This minimalist style means making use of minimum words for narration. He makes so much use of dialogues, but description is given very less scope. So this minimalist style shoots the theme of the story as it portrays a 9-year-old boy's stoic determination to maintain grace under the pressure of his impending death. This style is very much suitable to the theme of the story or the central incidents of the story. Hemingway further uses vivid verbs and precise nouns. Vivid verbs means those verbs, reading them, we are able to visualize what is actually happening in the story, and similarly he makes use of precise nouns. Further, he uses slightly long sentences for descriptions and short sentences for dialogues. Almost all dialogues between Shaz and his father are very short. The dialogues used are realistic, which help to reveal characters. A slice of life story. A slice of life story is a depiction of a mundane event that happens in a person's life, which often looks insignificant but has far-reaching implications. So many short stories that we read, these short stories are slice of life stories. Now this particular short story, A Day's Wait, can be called a slice of life story. How? In A Day's Wait, the author narrates a day in the life of a 9-year-old boy who catches flu, a very common disease, mundane incidents, and overhearing the doctor's diagnosis confuses the reading of the doctor's thermometer with the one that he has heard in a school in France. So the incidence is very much common, very much mundane, taken as if from real life, and that's why we can say that this is a slice of life story. Eventually, at the end of the story, the boy's conflict is resolved. The story is very simple, spanning over a period of one day. Now, at the end of this lecture, let us see or discuss MCQs, which might be asked in your examination. So the first MCQ, the author of the Book of Pirates. You might remember, if you have read the story, you might remember that when Shaz was ill, his father, he sits beside his bed and he begins reading Book of Pirates. So this particular question, who is the author of the who is the author of this particular book, Book of Pirates? Howard Pyle, Shaz's father, Ernest Hemingway. The correct answer is A. Howard Pyle. Second question. In the beginning of the story, Shaz complained of dash. What happens if you remember? In the beginning of the story, Shaz is ill and he complains of something. What does he complain of? A headache, a toothache, a backache, or fever? It is a headache. How old is Shaz? 9 years, 19 years, 29 years, 39 years. We know that Shaz was a boy of 9 years. The doctor prescribed 3 different medicines for dash purpose. What was the purpose? To bring down the fever, as a purgative, to overcome acidity, all of the above. Correct answer is D, all of the above. Why did Shaz's father go out of his house with the Irish setter? To go for a stroll on the frozen creek, to shoot birds, to breathe fresh air, to hide his feelings from his son. Correct answer is B, to shoot birds. Next question. How much did Shaz's temperature really measure? 100, 102, 102 and 4/10, 104. Correct answer is B, which I have mistakenly written A, the second one 102. Shaz had a misunderstanding regarding dash. 2 thermometers, book of pirates, miles and kilometers, 2 parrots. Correct answer is B, correct answer is A, 2 thermometers, Fahrenheit and Celsius. Shaz's father removes his misunderstanding by showing the difference between dash. He gives a very common example through which Shaz can remove his misunderstanding. 2 thermometers, book of pirates, miles and kilometers, and 2 parrots. Correct answer is C, miles and kilometers. What kind of person is Shaz's father? Happy-go-lucky, detached, concerned, cool. We can say that he is a concerned father. C. In the story, a day's wait, Shaz waits for dash. It is death, reading book of pirates, going to France for study, none of the above. The correct answer is death. Another question. Who narrates the story A Day's Wait? Narrator of the story. Shaz, Shaz's mother, Shaz's father, doctor. Correct answer is C, Shaz's father. How does the boy spend his day of illness? On sofa, reading his favorite book, sits beside fire, cries and weeps in bed, anticipating his death. Correct answer is D, in bed, anticipating his death. Shaz is dash, coward, a brave boy, a naughty boy, a loner. We can say that Shaz is a brave boy because even though he knows that he is going to die, he faces death bravely. What important events make up the action of the story? Father calling the doctor, Shaz asking about his temperature, Shaz asking the question about the time of his death, all of the above. The correct answer is D, all of the above events are important in the story. So friends, this is the end of the lecture on the short story A Day's Wait. I hope that you have been able to understand and appreciate the short story, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.